I'm absolutely delighted to introduce to you Dr. Sam Tsemberis. Let me tell you a little bit about Sam. Sam is a clinical community psychologist who developed the Housing First model. He serves as president CEO of the Pathway Housing First Institute and on the faculty of the Department of Psychiatry of New York Presbyterian Hospital, Columbia University Medical Center. Sam also serves as an executive director for the VA-UCLA Center of Excellence for Training and Research of Veterans Homelessness, and clinical director for Housing First for Youth Canada. Sam's received lots of awards, I read here. Let me tell you, Sam, he's received wide recognition and numerous awards, including the American Psychiatric Association's Gold Award for Community Mental Health Programs and the Distinguished Contribution to Independent Practice Award from the American Psychological Association. It's really fantastic to have you here, Sam. Sam has told me that he now spends a lot of time traveling the world, I guess, promoting the Housing First concept, training, lobbying, advising on the issue, not only around North American continent, New York, Los Angeles, Toronto, but also Europe and further afield, Rome, Helsinki, Paris, Wellington, and now, of course, Sam, you can add to that exotic list, Merthyr, Tydfil. Right. So, great to have you here. So, your first time in Wales, Sam? Yeah, how are you finding it?
Oh, it's beautiful. Cardiff was an exciting, diverse city. I think there's sort of the impression that just walking the streets and seeing all of the varieties of people, kind of overwhelming shopping arcade in the middle of the place. Talking to the minister yesterday and being reminded that there's something about smaller countries that has a certain hopefulness to it for me in terms of access, and the sense of community is still in some ways intact. And also the magnitude of the problem of homelessness seems somehow manageable. But it's great to be here, and thanks for inviting me.
Great, thanks for that. So what I'm going to do, I've got a few questions I'd like to ask Sam, but then it will be opened up to all of you. Okay, so Sam, I'd like to ask you, I mean, I was recently reading the Washington Post, he lies, but I know, I saw a
like
headline.
You do every evening,
every day. But the Washington Post once described you as the outsider who accidentally solved chronic street homelessness. Why outsider and why accidentally?
Well, I didn't write the byline, so I can't account for it. But I think what that refers to, and I think maybe it's at the epicenter of this idea of housing first. Housing first points everyone in the direction of housing as sort of the key focus of the program. Yeah. And for me, when I was talking to the reporter, it was clear that the intervention of Housing First was never really about housing. It was an intervention that was an effort to try and engage people who had severe mental illness who were on the street. I mean, I was working as a psychologist at Bellevue Hospital at the time, and leaving work, some of the people that we had seen on the wards were on the street. And so the goal always was, can we have a conversation? Can we engage people and figure out what it is that they need in order to help them better? I fully anticipated that would be a kind of a clinical intervention, but that's not what people wanted. People wanted housing first, so I had to learn about the housing business, and I think I went into learning about housing from the outside. I was never a housing provider. It was not an intention of mine to enter into the housing domain. So I think that's the outsider part. It wasn't really something that was designed from within the homelessness or housing or supportive housing industry. It really was something that came from mental health. And brought to housing.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about the Housing First story, you know, where it started and how it started.
Well, that's sort of how it started, in the sense of wanting to engage people with mental illness who happened to be homeless.
Sure.
So the effort was always in the engagement. How it started was really having sort of the experience of repeated failure. Before we started Housing First, I was working as a street outreach worker in New York City, and basically charged with operating what some people called a psychiatric emergency room on the streets. Now you have to think this is many years ago, so the number of people on the streets of New York were in the thousands, 12,000, 14,000. And so this particular team, consisting of a psychiatrist, a social worker, a nurse, a psychologist, 2 or 3 of us in a van driving around the city, and really only looking for people among the homeless that maybe needed some counseling, some other intervention. And we would be authorized by the city to take people to the hospital involuntarily if necessary, if they were a danger to themselves or others. So it was an emergency room on wheels, and it had the authority to bring people to the actual emergency room. And it was a painful kind of a job, because most people did not want to go to the emergency room. We often had to call the police, and the police had their own procedure. We would lose control of the situation, and the person would go whether they wanted to or not, often because they were oozing pus out of their shoes or coughing up blood, and we thought their medical condition was so compromised that we couldn't leave them on the street. Having made that decision, 30 days later, that same person would be back out on the street, and with their same shopping bag, often that they had been brought to the hospital with. And so that was, very, very difficult, and who missed the cue there, and why is this person back, and repeat that a few times. And it was out of that kind of desperation and sense of futility that we had to do something else. Yeah. And the something else was really for us to take a step back and say, what we're doing isn't working, and what can we do that's different? And we began to look around, and we came upon this psych rehab approach, which is a very different approach. It's much more rehabilitative. It's not biological psychiatry. It's not prescriptive. It's not directive. It's really client-driven. Sure. And I think that to the extent that there was a revolution in thinking, it was really changing our own thinking to a more humble and accepting approach to say, we don't know what is best for people. We have to allow people to express what's best for them. They know what's in their own self-interest, yeah. And we have to go with that, even if it seems something that maybe we don't agree with. And people were very clear and very quick to answer that what was needed for them was a place to live first and foremost. And that's what led us to the housing. Had to write a grant because no one would actually accept the referrals. We were trying to bring people from the streets to the existing housing providers, but people wanted sobriety, they wanted treatment, they wanted conforming with house rules, things that the people we were working with either could not or would not participate in. And we ended up creating Pathways to Housing, a nonprofit, so that we can actually accept our own referrals and bring people into their housing.
Sure. Yesterday you told me that, that this move towards actually asking people what they want was quite a scary move for many professionals. Was kind of, it isn't the usual model, as it were.
Well, yeah, I mean, you have to go back to, for me, this whole thing was an experiment, yeah. Because we had been trained to believe that people with schizophrenia or people with psychotic disorders could not manage. They needed supervised living. This is the culture we grew up in. Yeah. And when the people that we were talking to were saying, no, I know the difference between mental illness and you know what I can do, and I know the difference between addiction and what gets in my way. I've been drinking since high school. I've had mental illness since my 20s. This is a 40 or 50-year-old man talking about his experience and knowing himself what the difference is. And he clearly wanted a place to live above everything else. What was scary was that then we would have to take the word of someone that didn't have a lot of credibility and go against the grain of our own training to allow that to happen. And we would rent an apartment in a, you know, a regular New York City apartment building, 20, 40 units, and we had to leave that person there overnight. And there were other families and other people there, and you had to kind of suspend your prejudice, fear, bias, and say, we're going to give this a try. We're going to give this a try. And the experiment was always, can people really know for themselves what's best for them and actually do it? And so we certainly held our breath overnight, you know, for the first months and months until it was clear. And then it became obvious in hindsight. Somebody on the streets who knows where to get food, where to sleep, how to stay safe, for them, moving into an apartment was actually a piece of cake. The hard part was for us to kind of get over our own fears about it. So people began to do very, very well right from the get-go. You know, that was the discovery. The discovery was that people are much more capable than we had given them credit for.
Great. Yeah, as I said earlier, Sam, you travel the world. Promoting the housing first approach. I mean, do you see, I mean, are there different models of housing first in different parts of the world? Is it the same model everywhere, or does it have to adapt? What's it look like?
There are, you know, there are variations in the model. The model, I think that the principles of the model are portable. I think that's why it's traveled so well. You know, believing in giving people a choice, separating housing from treatment so that people don't require treatment to get in and don't require treatment to stay in, adjusting the support services to the needs of the people, and community integration. I think all of the Housing First programs have more or less of that. I would say, especially the first, people get housing right away. I think they struggle with having the support services in place. There's quite a bit of variation. People think of this still very much as a housing program, not a rehabilitation or recovery program, and so they tend to implement the program a bit on the cheap, I would say, and so that they have case management and minimal supports, but not sufficient supports. And so a lot of places have implemented Housing First, targeting the very people I was describing earlier, most vulnerable, but then not really being, not really providing the support services that they need in order to keep the kind of the trajectory of recovery. So it becomes into housing maintenance as opposed to into housing as a first step towards a greater recovery. That's one variation. The other variation is that some places have implemented the program scattered site, and others have used single site buildings in a harm reduction way, which has some of the characteristics of Housing First, but I still can't help but to see that as more institutional living. Even though it is barrier-free housing, it's not in the spirit of Housing First, individual choice and recovery.
I mean, this sounds a crazy thing to ask the person who founded the idea, but how much of a purist are you about Housing First? I mean, it sounds to me that you can accept the variations, but within a set of principles.
I'm a pragmatist, I'm not a purist. I really, you know, there's variations, and as, you know, I mean, we have to agree that if somebody's getting off the street, that's a great thing. And so that's step one. And then the question is, how much do you want to invest in actually the recovery of people? And I think if we hold the definition too firmly, it'll preclude dissemination. And if you don't have a definition at all, then everyone's calling what they're doing Housing First because it's a popular thing to do now. So that's kind of the balance.
wonder if you could, one of the things that we sometimes hear is some concern amongst potential providers about what they see as the lack of conditionality around support. You know, the idea that support is an essential element of it. I think you've said yourself, people who want housing first need more than housing.
Yes.
They need that support. But there's some fear we hear of providers being concerned about the fact that people can make a choice about whether they take that support or not. I mean, what would you say to them?
Well, I think that's a misunderstanding in the model.
Yeah.
I think that, you know, from the very beginning, it should be made clear to the prospective tenant that there are two conditions to the program. I mean, we always had two conditions. Actually, we used to have three. Now we've reduced it to two. But the two conditions are that you have to abide by the terms and conditions of a standard lease like every other tenant in the building. Yeah. You know, you're not exempt, we're not exempting people from the rules of the community that they're living in. We can't, and that wouldn't be the way to do it. That would kind of work against you on the integration side. But the other mandatory thing is that you have to accept a home visit. And I think that's where there's some confusion. I think that it's clear that treatment is not mandatory, but a home visit is mandatory. And there's a bit of a, that's not like a shuffling or doing something that is not transparent to the person. The home visit is mandatory because we want to make sure that the person is managing the apartment, managing their tenancy well, and they're doing okay. That's not a requirement for treatment. Yeah. That's a requirement for a visit and checking in on people. Requiring treatment is, you know, there's lots of programs that require treatment. That's urine talks, mandatory medication, participation in groups. There's none of that. But there is a requirement that you have to see us. We can't take people who are in all kinds of complex, challenging situations and put them into housing and leave them alone. I mean, that's the housing only is not what it is. It's housing first, but not housing only. And I think that there's an art to engaging people. And this is where it gets a little fuzzy for me also, because you hope that people will do much better once they're housed. Yeah. And you want them to do much better. And they themselves sometimes feel they've been beaten down for quite some time, and that they have secured housing. They feel that's enough. I'm good. I'm fine now. I don't need anything else. And it's true. They are. But how do you introduce the idea of life can be better for you, but at the same time it's a client-driven program, so you don't want to impose that idea. You want to awaken a kind of a hopefulness in people that they'll want something more for themselves.
Sure. I don't think I'm giving anything away here, but the Minister asked, I think yesterday, a very interesting question about use of the private rented sector. Right. And I think you use that, that visit as a really important element of how we might encourage private rented landlords in. I mean, do you want to just...
Well, I think that the partnership, you need partners, you need housing partners, and the more you have, the better. I mean, social housing is a partnership. I think even social housing landlords are sometimes reluctant to house people with complex needs because they don't have the capacity to support those kinds of tenants, and certainly in the private market, even more so. So the description of the program to these partners, and I have to say, without the landlords, we have no program, and so they're key to this. And the thing that assures landlords is that the certainty of the rent payment, because if you're going to run a Housing First program, you have to have the rent supplement in hand. It's not. This is another part of what people call Housing First, and it isn't, is, you know, the promise that we're going to look for housing and we'll figure it out somehow. That's not exactly, the program needs to have in place a rent supplement so you can actually start looking for housing right away, and the support services. So the guarantee of the rent is a big selling point to landlords. They won't have to be looking for it at the first of the month. The other selling point is the fact that the person working with the landlord will assure the landlord that if there's an issue with the tenancy, that the program will respond. The program's case management services are not only for the tenant, they also support the landlord.
Yeah.
So if there's a housing crisis of any kind, there's a number to call and there's accountability. That's reassuring to the landlord, that they don't have to go to court or have to kind of get into a legal issue about the tenancy.
Sure, sure.
The third thing I think that we came up in that conversation was also an appreciation of landlords in participating in programs like this, that as a sort of a public or a community recognition of their contribution to ending homelessness, to participating in the community, taking a chance on tenants that have no credit history, no residential, no recommendations, and they're willing to go with you and make that tenancy happen, I think should be recognized also.
Yes, that's right. Just a question really, I guess, about messaging housing first. What is getting an understanding of it? Because we certainly pick up some resistance to the concept of housing first. There's a recently, I think it was a particular local authority who will remain nameless, but if you want to talk to me afterwards, no. Who the members, the elected members, decided they wouldn't look at or explore a housing first option. And I think it was because some of them felt that in some way it was a reward for fecklessness. That in fact it was like a queue jumping issue. So I've had families on my waiting list for many years now, hard-working families, you know the rhetoric, and this person who's been on the streets, we're suddenly finding somewhere for that person to live. I mean, how do we overcome that? How do we message in a positive way the positive elements about housing first?
That's a tough sell, and I think that it's really it's going to require someone understanding that this idea of someone, of a family or other individual waiting for years in a queue for social housing is a different group than the person who's struggling on the street. That this person on the street is vulnerable and will not be found, even if they were around years later when their turn came up. And the only way that, I think if the housing authority or landlords of the social housing would be willing to accept that as a premise, that we need a different system in order to give access to this group, in communities where it's worked well, a small percentage of the social housing vacancies have been set aside for this group of people, so that there are two ways of entering social housing: the traditional waiting in line, and then for some small group of people who have been homeless for a while and have vulnerabilities, there's a percentage of units that they can access directly. There's no way around it except to create a different a different entry system.
Sure.
Because it's it's not fair to jump the queue, and on the other hand, it's not fair to have a queue for those that can't be in it.
Sure. Sure. I've got one more question, then I'm going to hand you over to the tender mercies of the audience. And Jenny, I'm sure you've picked up, Sam, there's a tremendous keenness in Wales to take housing first forward. I know you were impressed with the discussion with the Minister yesterday. Welsh Government's backing lots of providers. I bet almost just about, I guess everybody in this room wants to take housing first forward. What one thing could we do in Wales, you think, to really accelerate that momentum? Is there one thing we can do?
Well, I don't know. I mean, they could do any number of things, but I think, one of the things that's worked well nationally in other places is to have a kind of a multi-site demonstration project that it can work, in a number of different, both urban and rural areas. And I think that even though there's evidence of its effectiveness in a lot of places, somehow it always has to be demonstrated locally.
Sure.
And it sort of takes a step-by-step approach. But I think a national demonstration project would be a great start, kickstart. It is actually about solving income disparity, but I don't know if we're going to solve that anytime soon. I mean, it is absolutely about homes, but it's not only about homes, it's about also the supports. Yeah. I think maybe this person was, I don't know, maybe are they thinking that the homes is a good start, and then you need more, you need job, you need reconnection with family, you need that, and I'm in complete agreement with that. The graduation, in my experience, happens in different ways, but I'll tell you programmatically, if you're operating one of these programs, it would be great to think about graduation right from the point of admission. And the way that that's done is that initially when people come in, they're quite exhausted or just can't. They need a lot of support. So a lot of the early part of the work is you doing a lot of the work. But over time, there should be kind of an arc to it so that then you're helping the person do the work and then the person's doing the work on their own. So it has that kind of trajectory. The reason that I think of it as graduation is that you want to celebrate every small gain along the way. If you wait to celebrate graduation, that could be years, but there are gains made every day as people adjust and do better in their lives, and you want to have a program culture that recognizes that and celebrates that. People do better in getting their health back, getting their family reconnected. So the need for services over time gets less. So you visit less frequently, or maybe they don't need case management at all. And that's a celebration every step along the way. But they may graduate case management altogether, but people get better from mental illness and addiction quicker than they do from graduating poverty. So they might be well, but they're still very poor. And so the graduation out of needing the rent supplement, is not as quick as graduating from the clinical services. So as you're working the program, you should know that the graduation trajectory is different for the housing need versus the clinical need. But people do graduate. Well, the way that it's being implemented right now in Ottawa is they're doing a multi-site study in 3 cities in Ontario, Ottawa and Toronto and Hamilton, I believe. And I think that the way that the program is described for youth is with a sensitivity to the particular needs of young people, which in many ways are similar in terms of the overall guiding principles. The self-determination, hugely important there as well. The separation of housing. The housing type looks different. I mean, when young people are choosing housing, they may choose to live with others. They might choose different kinds of residential setups. And I think the idea of permanence is not quite the same as it is for adults in terms of they might be thinking of it as a transitional time. The service support is different. When you're working with the group that I was describing initially, you would need for sure, mental health and addiction treatment and employment. Whereas with youth, you need employment, education, support, peer support. There's a lot of peer specialists on the team, so that the service array would be different. I think the expectation for graduation might be different. So that, I think that you're not going to find people with the same clinical needs. There's going to be much more in terms of trauma-informed practice, so that in many ways it might look the same structurally. There's an apartment and services, but the composition of those services will be quite different, and the support services will be different. Those are some of the ways. The support services need to reflect the complexity and the needs of the people that you're housing. So that as the program starts, you might have a specific population that you're targeting, whether it's youth or women or families or adults with severe mental illness and complex needs. So you know who's coming. And so you'd want to anticipate and have in place the kinds of services that the group that you've housed will possibly need. Now, that could be, and this is where it becomes kind of a funding issue and like that. Ideally, you'd want the services there so you can provide them directly, but sometimes that's costly. And you would want to have some brokerage arrangement or some understanding with, let's say, the health ministry or another support service that would partner with you in terms of providing the kinds of services that people needed. I think that the ideal setup really for these kinds of programs, let's say we're going to do this nationally, I would say that the housing ministry would work hard to have the rent supplements or build social housing. They would take care of the either bricks or mortars or rental piece of it, and that also requires support, you know, for the landlord management issues, lease issues, finding the units issues, the sort of property management support. And the health service would be transformed to make house calls to those clients that were housed, because they are looking after the health and wellness of clients. That's a perfect kind of partnership for a Housing First program writ large.
Who wrote that?
You know, I mean, I know there are people that believe that. Yeah. It's sort of the hazard ratio rationale that you need to make services difficult to access, otherwise people will just, throw themselves on the street and sleep on the sidewalk for a year in hopes of getting an apartment eventually. I don't know even how to think about that. I mean, if someone's willing to sleep on the street for a whole year in the hopes of getting an apartment, maybe we should give them an apartment, you know? I mean, a lot of it has to do with, that's sort of an assumption that you don't know who the people are. And I think that if there's anything I would want to convey out of this conversation is that this program is not about housing, and it's not about a particular type of service. It's more that the services need to be there and the housing needs to be there, but it's all about the relationship that you have with the person. It's a person-centered program. And if you actually get to know someone, you know whether they're actually homeless and suffering from these challenges, or whether they are, homeless that night in hopes of getting into a Housing First program. I think, if you can't figure that out, probably not a good fit for you as a case manager in a Housing First program. When you talk to people who have had a lot of trauma, and homelessness is a trauma, the recovery takes a long time. So you're just at the beginning of a long road with folks. But I don't know that recovery is about ever saying, I didn't experience trauma. It's like, I've experienced trauma and I'm okay, but it's always been your history doesn't change. Your future can be more hopeful and you can be more part of the community, but that's always part of your history. There's no shame to it. It's just a fact of life. And so I don't know that you would need to worry about how to help the person change that. I think the accepting of that and the recognition of that is actually without judgment. I think maybe that's what's a little bit triggering, like you don't want them to think of themselves in a negative way. But for them, it may not be negative. It might be something that they have overcome, that they were homeless at one time and look at me now. So as a source of pride, as a source of where, how far they've moved. So I would not, I think that's what client-driven is all about, and you also bring out the fact that it's difficult to do this work, but it's got to be on the client's own terms, at their own pace, at their own sense of their self-identity and self-definition. I think it is, it's one of the things we didn't mention in terms of how Housing First is implemented different places. Some places not only do it with expectation, but there's also a timeline, like, oh, how long will it take for these people to get better, like with the clock running, which is really not a good setup, to feel that kind of pressure. So it is good that you don't have that. Community engagement is difficult because it's some of these things that we're talking about, and it has to do with the sense of the person's own belongingness to the community that they're in. In some ways, if you're doing the scattered site apartment version of Housing First, there is a built-in requirement for community engagement. People are living with neighbors, and they are, on a daily basis meeting at the front door or at the mailbox and participating that way. I think that we don't do a very good job of community engagement ourselves very focused on the client services. But what it could look like is, I think we leave it a lot to the client to figure out on their own. But I think if we were more intentional about it, we would walk through the neighborhood with them and do a kind of a neighborhood mapping, and where do you shop, and what about laundry services, and do you have other interests that maybe other places that you would need along the way? Let's look for them together. You'd have to co-design community integration for each client, because their interests could be widely different. And so even though they're in the same neighborhood, they're going to be focused on different aspects of that neighborhood and use different parts of it. Faith community, important to some people, not at all to others. Some people want the library, other people want to know where can they see a movie, or where is the best grocery store. And then there's always that sort of social grouping. Are there support groups? Are there other kinds of interests that they have? So it is something that you co-construct. I don't know if I've answered that very well, but it's difficult. It's a difficult and challenging thing.
I spend a lot of time playing golf with my clients.
Yeah, but the thing is, if you don't do it, and this, I don't know if you've experienced this, but people have a community when they're homeless, especially if they've been homeless for a while, and then they change. For some reason they get randomly picked, and boom, they're in a program. And not their buddies, and the people that they've had community with on the street are still out there. And that is a huge challenge, because people are leaving their apartments, going back to hang out with their friends, and sometimes they bring their friends to the apartments. And then you're, looking at a whole other challenge. And relocation is definitely, one of them. I mean, not everyone that goes into a Housing First apartment lives happily ever after. Many people need a second apartment because of this very issue. They're in their apartment lonely, or are they with their friends, but homeless. And so they may invite their friends the first time and get evicted because of the disruptive behaviors that go on there. And what the studies have found is that people that move into a second apartment actually do better than the ones that move in the first time, because they've actually learned something in there. What's tough on the program side is that it's an ordeal to move people and to kind of let them learn from that experience, as opposed to punish them or discharge them from the program. You have to kind of be willing to tolerate the chaos and risk of that. It was easier to address the issue of homelessness than it was to take on the medical model of the mental health system. But the intention was always to take down the medical model in the mental health system. It just was kind of a Trojan horse approach to doing that. But that's where the revolution really belongs, because I think that's, the traditional treatment system has failed the people that are on the street, and there's no even acknowledgement of that. The issue of how, it's an ongoing battle. And I think that you can't control the language use and the atmosphere and the culture in a small program. And then how do you influence the larger system as you interact with it, I think is really, and it's not just the mental health system, it's the benefits system, it's the other criminal justice. We're doing a harm reduction model, but some people have a probation officer, and I think that part of the job, frankly, is not only the case management or the support service that you offer the tenant, but the advocacy to the rest of the system that your tenant interacts with should be understood as part of our responsibility, because you have a user-friendly little program, but an un-user-friendly larger system. And so you want to have your tenant, the person you're supporting, succeed in that as well, and that takes a lot of advocacy to all of those other systems. It's just part of the change, I think. I think it's difficult to, and maybe this is why they introduce Housing First programs in small pilot projects, because I think that there are different forms of resistance to change, and the existing provider community is one of the strongest forms of resistance to change. And it's not really overt, it's not really spoken about, but I can tell you that policymakers love the idea of a more efficient and cost-effective program. Consumers love the idea of Housing First. The group that is the most difficult to bring along is the existing provider community, because they begin to read Housing First as the end of their business. And so the question is, how do we transform that thinking into a partnership? And I think that what is one way of doing that is defining the change in the system as a transformation for the existing system providers. It's not an elimination of existing services, it's a transformation of existing services. For example, in Finland, where they had a legislative move to Housing First, part of that move took the national lottery money and started converting shelters into permanent housing. That was the elimination of shelter beds, but that was also a transformation of the shelter system into a permanent housing program, so that the agency that was running a shelter is now running permanent housing, so that existing providers have to see that there's a place at the table for them in the new system. We still need housing and support services, except rather than temporary, now it's going to be permanent. We'll still need the support services to help people manage their way through that. So that rather than thinking of Housing First as eliminating other services, it's a housing, and this is very purposefully worded. Owen O'Sullivan and the Fianza group talk about housing-led approaches as opposed to housing first. Housing first is a program model. Housing-led is more of an attitude about getting people out of emergency and transitional services into permanent, so that housing-led is a larger table we can all participate in more comfortably because we're all moving in the same direction. We want to shorten shelter and hostel and transitional stays and increase permanent housing, so that we're all working to transform something rather than this is going to eliminate that. What's interesting in the transformation over the years, it used to be that a particular agency wanted to start a Housing First program, the Salvation Army here, or a nonprofit in another place. Somebody heard about it, and the value fit for that agency was very compatible with Housing First. That's the other part of the transformation. It's like Housing First isn't like so unique that no one has been doing recovery-oriented services or person-centered care or all of trauma-informed or all of these other good things. For those agencies that were already kind of in a progressive mental health advocacy mindset, it was relatively a step or two away. And for other agencies that were more like, abstinence, sobriety, and then housing, that was a sea change for them. And so the transformation was initially the early adapters were agencies that were quite close to the values and the practice, and they just did a few more things and kind of brought the program in. Over time, as the evidence for effectiveness became more compelling, I think there were probably two huge changes that I can identify that made it go from agency to national and then international. In the first case, it was really an infusion of funding from the government to say that if you want funding in next year's grant application, you need to put people in housing within a month, you need to support them. It wasn't called Housing First, but there's no way you can actually meet the terms of the contract without doing it that way. So that, the definition of the program and the funding to get it started changes people's attitudes much more than, debate or conversation. The other thing that happened was, much later in 2009, the Canadian study, where, how many people have heard of the at-home chez soi study that was done in Canada? I'll just tell you briefly that this study, probably the largest Housing First study in the world, I think, was done in Canada between 2009 and 2014. It was a 5-year study, and the government had the wherewithal to actually move the federal dollars into something called the Mental Health Commission of Canada, which is an arm's-length organization away from government. In case there was an election and things changed, they wanted to make sure that the study would continue. It was $110 million, $90 million for housing and services, about $45 million each, and $20 million for a research study at each of the 5 cities that were funded by this program. And the cities were Moncton, Montreal, Toronto, Winnipeg, and Vancouver, coast to coast in Canada. The people that qualified for the study were people that had been homeless for a long time, had a mental health issue, had addiction health issues. The longer the list, the more likely to qualify, but it was the Mental Health Commission, so you needed at a minimum homelessness and mental illness. 2,250, something like that, people qualified in these 5 cities, and they were randomly assigned to either Housing First, that was set up by the money that was part of the grant, or to treatment as usual in those cities. So the study was completed. 24 months later, the Housing First group got housed and stayed housed about 80% of the time. Treatment as usual group 24 months later, about 35% of the time. That was, great outcomes for this kind of work, but not totally surprising. What was very surprising was that the federal government in Canada read the study and decided to allocate federal money according to an evidence-based practice, so that instead of getting money from the federal government to do as you wanted to as a community, you had to spend 50 cents of every dollar doing housing first in the city where you're getting funded. That created enormous upheaval, and communities had to retool their homeless services to do housing first. You know this because you've been there. Anyway, it had a tremendous impact in Canada. The French saw this and did an implementation similarly in Chez Soi d'Abord, 4 French cities, randomized controlled trial, tremendous results in eliminating hospitalization for the groups because France didn't have much of a community mental health system. And so suddenly Housing First went from being one agency and another agency to this country and then that country. And so the dissemination went from a kind of a agency to agency to a nation to nation kind of dissemination, so that it's still, it's still, though, with all of that in Europe, someone was quoting the data, there's still maybe 10,000, 5 to 10,000 housing first beds, but there are still 400,000 shelter or transitional housing beds. So, we talk about housing first like it's everywhere and it's really strong, but in fact, in the big picture, we have a long way to go to bring it to scale. There's actually been some very good evidence that offering a woman in a partner violence situation a place of her own, with her kids often, actually has helped women to leave the abusive situation earlier, because sometimes they're staying in these abusive situations because they don't want to go to the shelter. And so that kind of a model has worked well. The program I'm referring to is in Portland, Oregon, and I had seen a presentation recently by the woman who ran the domestic violence shelter and was transforming it to a Housing First program. So it's really, you still need the funds for the support and the rent, but again, it would be an issue of transformation and offering a different kind of alternative for women. And we don't have the evidence yet, but the response of the women, I think, speaks for itself. Look, we work in a very competitive sector, and so I think that's always going to be an issue of who's making the best argument and how to get the funding. Yeah. And I think that's one of the reasons that we always encourage a kind of a data analytic or program evaluation approach, because if you're doing something, you actually have to be documenting its effectiveness. That'll give you a leg up on the funding.
Thanks for having me.